Hey everybody, Tactic Angel here, back on the PlayStation 4, playing some World of Warships Legends, and I do want to say I really do appreciate all of the positive feedback I got on my Charles Madden video. So today we're going to be taking a look at another commander, George Dewey, in this second installment of The Man, the Math, the Legend. Like my ship reviews, I'm going to start off by taking a little bit of time to talk about history, then we're going to move into analysis, his abilities, and talk a bit about using Dewey as an inspiration for your other commanders. Since Dewey is the basic American commander, the structure of this is going to be a little bit different from last time, so I'll be happy for any feedback that you have down in the comments once again. And of course, I should have left an index down in the description if you do want to skip around. But with all of that out of the way, let's just get into this review. George Dewey was born on December 26, 1837, to Julius Dewey and Marion Perrin in Montpelier, Vermont. For those of you unfamiliar with Montpelier, Vermont, it is the least populous state capital in the modern United States. Though his father was in the life insurance industry, he encouraged his son to attend West Point to become an Army officer, and helped him to apply to Norwich University. Unfortunately, the university did not fully appreciate the hilarity of his drunkenness or the presence of sheep in the student barracks. As a result, he was expelled a short 2 years later. Following this, he chose to attend the relatively recently opened Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. You might find some sources that say he graduated towards the top of his class, but in fact he graduated 5th in his class, which sounds pretty decent until you realize there were only 14 total people in his class. So it's probably safer to say that he was somewhere in the middle. Dewey would participate in 2 major conflicts. The first was the American Civil War. At the beginning of the war, he was serving as executive lieutenant aboard the USS Mississippi, a paddle-driven steam frigate. The ship, notably, in April 1862, rammed the CSS Manassas, an ironclad ram ship. Driving her aground, she then took her apart with broadsides. Unfortunately, his service aboard the Mississippi was cut short when, in the following March, it ran aground while trying to pass Fort Hudson. Coming under fire for several hours, the crew made a valiant attempt to try to refloat the ship, but eventually had to abandon her to sink and then detonate. Dewey was noted as among the last to actually leave the doomed ship. Following this, he was transferred several times before ending up on the USS Colorado. The Colorado was present at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the South. Though Fort Fisher was only an earthwork fortress, it had proven resilient to a 3-week Union siege a month earlier. Because the Colorado was wooden and unarmored, she was placed towards the back of the line, behind the monitors and other more well-armored warships. During the 3-day assault on the fort, Colorado took several hits in the battle. When the fort began to fall, Dewey's squadron was ordered in to silence a portion of the fort's defenses. When other officers protested and dithered, it was Dewey that took the Colorado in to exploit the growing weakness, aiding in the Union's victory, which was secured a short 15 minutes later. When Admiral Porter came to congratulate Commodore Thatcher on the maneuver, the Commodore graciously passed the glory down to Lieutenant Dewey. Then, when Thatcher was promoted, he attempted to even take Dewey with him as his fleet captain, which would have been quite a promotion, one, unfortunately, that the Navy would not allow, though Dewey would rise to the rank of lieutenant commander instead. It would actually take almost another 20 years before Dewey made captain, and then after that another 9 before he made Commodore, a rank that, at the time, was nestled between captain and rear admiral. Though at one point Spain numbered among the most powerful empires in the world, basically since the founding of America, her grip on foreign lands had been slipping away bit by bit. Still, towards the end of the 19th century, she had dominion over several foreign territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines. The reason why those territories are important is because towards the end of the 19th century, with the United States stretching from sea to shining sea, and almost all of the continental states having been brought into the Union, the United States was starting to think of itself as a major player on the world scene, and it wanted those overseas foreign territories to prove it. Of course, over this period, the diplomatic situation between the United States and Spain, mostly over what we'll call Spain's horrific treatment of Cuba, had been steadily deteriorating. When the USS Maine blew up while she was in port at Havana, Americans blamed Spain. Though improbable, because the Philippines were a third of the world away from either Spain or the United States, it would become one of the major theaters of the war. When the Spanish-American War began, Dewey was commander of the Asiatic Squadron aboard his flagship, the Olympia, a truly unique American Navy ship and a gorgeous protected cruiser which is preserved as a museum ship to this day in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. More than just pretty, though, the American fleet was much more modern and well-trained than their Spanish Navy opposition, which suffered from antiquated ships, abysmal gunnery, and even a battleship without a proper boiler that had to be towed into battle. The only thing that apparently the American fleet lacked when they engaged the Spanish fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay was a good feel for how many shells they were carrying, as Dewey had to break off the attack, presumably to let his men eat breakfast, but in actuality to make sure there were actually enough shells to finish the fleet action. The battle ended with the Spanish fleet in ruins and Dewey going on to assist with fire support missions in the Philippines. This crushing victory, which numbers among the most one-sided battles in history, made Dewey a household name in the United States. America had never fought a war like this, defeating a European empire, though but a shadow of its former self, in an exotic and distant land, and expanded its territory and influence, though objectively I think it's safe to say that Dewey's more significant and perilous service was during the Civil War. Regardless of that fact, though, Dewey was awarded several honors, including a sword gifted to him by a special act of Congress that was worth more than $10,000 at the time. For perspective, this would be like giving someone a sword worth more than $250,000 in 2020. He also received a special medal created to commemorate the Battle of Manila Bay, along with every other naval officer, sailor, and Marine present for the battle. The medal itself featured a portrait of Commodore Dewey on the obverse and the name, rank, and ship of each recipient on the reverse. For obvious reasons, sometimes the Battle of Manila Bay medal is called the Dewey Medal for this reason. Dewey was one of only 4 Americans in history authorized to wear a medal which bore his own image upon it, but out of a sense of modesty, he actually wore the medal backwards. Finally, he was made Admiral of the Navy, equivalent to a 6-star admiral, making him the highest-ranking admiral in U.S. Navy history. Though Dewey was noted as never having voted for a presidential election, he was so popular that he was considered for the Democratic Party nomination in 1900. But, as it turns out, he proved to be not partisan enough, a little too honest, and probably not interested enough in the position, proving that he had one of the best character traits common to American military commanders who were considered for political office, that of soldier servant. His position of Admiral of the Navy eliminated any requirements for mandatory retirement age, and Dewey would serve the United States until the end of his life, closing out his career as chairman of the General Board of the United States Navy, an advisory board that exists from 1900 until 1951. The General Board itself was vested with some power at its founding, sort of like the General Staff, but over time would shed many of its official responsibilities and become something akin to a think tank, helping to bring the United States into the modern naval era. At the time of his death in 1917, George Dewey, who had begun his career on ships of wood and sail, was helping to prepare American super dreadnoughts for war with Germany. George Dewey is included in World of Warships legends for his lifetime of service, around 60 years, to the United States Navy, and the wisdom that comes with that kind of experience, which helped the United States take the steps needed to perform its part during the Great War and beyond. George Dewey is the base commander for the United States Navy ships in World of Warships Legends, and because of that, he has a lot of skills that are at least mildly usable for several classes. The trouble with these base commanders is, of course, none of their abilities are likely to really impress you, but since you have a mixture of abilities, people like Dewey can be very useful in making some hybrid or unconventional builds. Since Dewey is a base commander, I'm going to approach this a little bit different than the last time. We'll first talk about Dewey as a destroyer commander, then we'll talk about Dewey as a cruiser commander, and then we'll finish off with Dewey as a battleship commander. Starting out with destroyers, your best bet in most destroyers is probably going to be either to start out with contact as imminent or burn it down. Both of these are viable because American ships are heavy in the gun department and have somewhat underwhelming torpedoes, at least in terms of range and speed. The smarter or more traditional option is probably to go ahead and buff your torpedoes because the increase in speed is always going to be useful, but an increase in fire chance is actually fairly noticeable on American destroyers because they have a fairly low chance of fire to start out with, so a couple of percent can make a pretty decent difference. I wouldn't choose barely out of peril, not specifically because it's included here as a battleship perk, but because though ramming people is often a legitimate tactic, and I would say almost always hilarious, I probably wouldn't build your ship looking to go plow it into someone else. In slot 2, I've circled Look at Me Now, and that is because as a destroyer, you should be fairly careful when shooting your guns, and stealth is a big advantage over cruisers and battleships. Against other destroyers, you're probably going to want as much stealth as possible because in most cases, other nation destroyers are going to spot you first. Taking this will help make the distance between spots a little bit more comfortable. The other two options aren't exactly awful, but for the most part, if you're on an American destroyer, you're going to have fairly fast rotating guns, and the torpedo visibility isn't going to do much for you in most cases. You have two decent options in slot 3, which either reduce your torpedo reload, which tends to be fairly long on these American destroyers, or increases the speed of your ship. Honestly, I think this comes down to, again, whether or not you think you're going to be torpedoing people to death or running down enemy destroyers with your gunboat. Just don't take on second thought because it's not really worth taking to increase what's probably already a pretty fast reload. In your fourth slot, you have 3 reasonable choices. Americans have the best smoke in the game, if not best hands down. Increasing the dispersion and deployment times is arguably unnecessary, but applying that small percentage to a relatively large number also means that you're going to get a lot of return from these choices. But since you're a gunboat, anything that increases the effectiveness of your guns, including the range of your guns, is also not a bad idea. And since you should be trying to get into knife fights with other destroyers, added rudder shift isn't going to hurt you either, but I would consider it the weakest of the 3 viable choices here. At the legendary tier, every American destroyer is going to benefit from Unstoppable. This is the best choice because you're very likely going to lose your engine or your rudder when you take a lot of damage. This will allow you to still limp away or stagger into torpedo range of your enemy, depending on what your motivation is. Now, some of you may have caught on that I have on this screen a Boss Dewey build, which I use specifically for the USS Kidd. Fully packed is an option, and I would say it's a weaker pick than Unstoppable for most American destroyers, except for the Kidd or possibly
insert future destroyer ship name here.
The key here is that the Kidd has 3 consumables, one of which is a heal, so this sort of non-traditional build works for that specific ship. Fully packed will give you an extra smoke screen and an extra speed boost on every American ship, so it can be occasionally useful on other American destroyers. I just wouldn't count on it on average. Currently, I can't think of an example where you should use Will to rebuild on a destroyer, so I've left that one crossed out. As for inspirations, I've listed other base commanders from left to right in order of usefulness, I would probably choose any of the ideal inspirations listed below over these choices. For the most part, you will probably want to lean into your stealth, but these other commanders have advantages that are listed below. Where cruisers are concerned, you probably want to lead with Burn It Down. If you're just starting out, Contact is Imminent isn't a terrible choice for the Phoenix or the Omaha, but none of the other American tech tree cruisers have torpedoes right now. As for ramming, it's hard to do in a cruiser. I'm not going to say I've never done it, but it's an even worse ideal than normal to build for that idea here. Slot 2 is a free-for-all, I'd like to say, because all three of these work pretty well for American ships. The smart money is probably going to lean towards turret rotation on your guns because that never hurts, but reducing your detectability isn't bad either, at least as long as you're the type of player that is patient enough not to shoot your guns immediately while stalking a battleship. I probably wouldn't recommend before it's too late, but if you're new to Legends and getting used to the game, this is going to give you just a little bit extra time to spot and start dodging those torpedoes. In slot 3, I think Warships wins pretty strongly here, just because most American ships don't have any torpedoes, and most of your guns still reload fast enough that if on second thought was ever a good idea, I still wouldn't think it would be here. Going faster never hurt anyone, and I will say that realizing that it is profoundly untrue in a lot of other contexts. In your 4th tier slot, I'd recommend Reaching Out, but understanding that it doesn't give you a huge boost here. It's just a small increase to your range. I'd recommend it over Steer Clear, which is a small boost to your maneuverability currently. And there's not even one American cruiser right now that benefits from smoke on the water as of the recording of this video. For your legendary rank, I'd stick with the same 2 recommendations, using either Unstoppable or Fully Packed. Though in this case, I think Fully Packed is probably going to help you a little bit more as a cruiser. You benefit from the consumables a little more than in destroyers, and typically you help your team quite a bit when you use them also. And then when we look at Will to Rebuild, even at high tiers when you have a heal, having an additional heal is almost certainly better than having a smaller number of ever so slightly better heals most of the time. Once again, I've put the base commanders that are going to help you with your build the most if you're just starting out in order from left to right. I would say that none of these are particularly strong either, so you're probably going to want to use one of the other following commanders once you have them available. By and large, you're going to get the most out of Norman Scott, but there's a real good chance that if you have Scott, you should probably be using him instead of Dewey in your cruisers. The rest of the advantages are listed on screen. Finally, we arrive at battleships. Now, I do have to say, Dewey's not going to give your average American battleship a lot of choices. So, it is kind of time for the sad violin music. In slot 1, you probably want to use Burn It Down XXL. You aren't going to have torpedoes, and ramming people is just as hilarious as a minute or two ago when I mentioned it, but I still think it's probably wrong to build for it. I haven't crossed it out this time, but please realize there are probably a lot more times that you want to use high explosive on a target than to run into it. Please note, though, that in an American battleship, you do want to probably shoot AP at most battleships and cruisers all the time. In the second slot, you'll probably get the most out of Crisscross. American battleship guns are universally slow at rotating to very, very slow, so every bit helps here. The other 2 options aren't going to hurt you, but I consider them to be a lot weaker, given the distance you're likely to get spotted at in a battleship, and it's probably going to be pretty hard to dodge torpedoes in an American battleship, even with the extra range. In the third slot, your best bet, and it isn't really great, is going to be to go for the speed. There's an argument that on second thought will help you sometimes, but it's usually better to empty your guns into a target and load the right type of shell than to just sacrifice the time, which is why I haven't crossed that one out. Similar to cruisers, you're going to benefit the most from increasing your range provided by Reaching Out. Since you have longer range guns, this is going to be a bigger advantage than you get in a cruiser, but Steer Clear remains a workable option. Since your rudder shift is going to be quite a bit longer, It is probably going to help you more than a cruiser here, but it's still going to be a pretty slow time turning around. The legendary ability is the only one where all three of these are viable. Your best bet here is probably still to take fully packed, because on a battleship, just like a cruiser, it's better to have more normal heals than slightly less improved heals. The other two choices are usable, but American battleships tend to have pretty durable engines and rudders, and again, will to rebuild is on average less useful than fully packed. As we move into inspiration, these base commanders are in order of their usefulness, but I would like to make a special note of John Jellicoe here. Since his ability increases the duration of your heal, he's actually not bad. And in particular, he's going to help you out quite a bit in the USS Colorado, since it already has a very good heal. He would be the only one that I might consider hanging on to if you get any of these ideal commanders that I've listed below here. I think the most popular of which is Andrew Cunningham. So I've already talked about what inspirations you might want to use Dewey for in all of the existing classes in the game right now. When you're considering using Dewey as an inspiration, frankly, I probably wouldn't. The thing is that increasing torpedo detectability doesn't give you a lot of extra time to dodge. With it maxed out, Dewey's going to give you somewhere between 80 and 150 meters of additional detectability in almost all cases. This is a fraction of a second, usually less than a quarter of a second, and even though that can matter, you're probably better off learning the tough love side of boats and learning to pre-dodge torpedoes that you can't see, because for the most part you'll find it's predictable when someone's shooting you with torpedoes. In any case, let me know what you thought of this review down in the comments. Since Dewey is a base commander, I wanted to explore what that sort of review might look like. Even if it wasn't perfect, I do hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.